when the bars closed, when the snow buried the barracks, when years were measured not by calendars, but by lashings of hunger. One question burned hotter than the frost. Who will still remember me? Who will still remain mine? For in the silence of the camps, men learned a secret the world has forgotten: what loyalty truly means. The camps were not merely prisons of stone and wire. They were furnaces in which human beings were melted down to their most basic elements. When a man entered, stripped of rank, family, and possessions, he was no longer what he had been. The Gulag was a crucible where illusions of civilization dissolved, and only the hard essence of character remained. It was here, in the wilderness of frost and hunger, that truth revealed itself in its most merciless form. The courtroom had already spoken, the state had already branded, but the real judgment came not from the authorities. It came from time, cold, hunger, the company of fellow sufferers. In the camp, every mask was torn away. A man's clever words, his education, his former importance in society, all counted for nothing when he bent beneath a log heavier than his own strength. When his ribs showed through his skin, his breath fogged in the icy air. At that moment, only the truth of who he was remained. Could he endure? Would he betray his comrades for an extra slice of bread? Would he cling to some last ember of dignity, or would he crumble into an animal driven only by instinct? These questions were not asked in philosophy books. They were written in the snow with the sweat and blood of the prisoners. The Gulag was also a mirror. It reflected not only the souls of the men within, but also the souls of those beyond the barbed wire. Letters from home became revelations. A line of words scratched in haste, delayed by censorship and travel, could either lift a man from despair or bury him deeper in the silence of abandonment. Those who received no letters understood a truth more terrible than frostbite. They had been forgotten, erased from the world as if they had never lived. And those who did receive words of love learned that loyalty, though rare, was the strongest form of nourishment. This crucible of truth did not discriminate. It burned away illusions of love, patriotism, loyalty, and even faith. A man who once thought himself virtuous might find his hands trembling as he stole bread from the dying. Another, once despised as weak, might give away his last ration to save another life. In the endless winter of the camps, time was no longer measured in days, but in the survival of conscience. Some men survived in body, but lost their souls. Others perished in body, yet carried their integrity to the grave. The state had intended the Gulag to be a place of punishment, a system to grind men into dust. But it became something more profound, something unintended, became the stage on which the deepest truths of human nature were performed. Here, the myth of loyalty, the myth of love, the myth of justice, all were tested against reality. And in this testing, survivors carried back with them not only scars but knowledge. Knowledge that the ordinary world could not comprehend. Knowledge that burned within them like an unquenchable fire. When the prison gates swallowed men whole, it was not only they who became captives of the state. Beyond the walls of barbed wire, in villages and cities where the frost of suspicion lay heavy, their wives, mothers, and lovers were shackled in another kind of imprisonment. They did not wear striped uniforms, nor march under the command of guards, but they carried burdens every bit as heavy. For every man condemned, a woman was left behind to fight a quieter, lonelier war, one with no certainty of victory and no promise of release. Female loyalty was not measured in words of affection spoken in warm homes, nor in the soft rhythms of ordinary life. It was measured in the harsh language of absence, in the patience of waiting years without answers, in the courage of facing neighbors' whispers and the state's surveillance. The women who remained faithful bore a mark of suspicion. They were linked in the eyes of society to traitors, to enemies of the people. To stand by their men was to risk ruin, to condemn themselves to queues for food that never came, to doors that were shut in their faces, to the constant gnawing question, would he ever return? And if not, what meaning could their sacrifice hold? There were women who endured. They wrote letters knowing most would never reach their destination. They raised children under the shadow of a father branded as criminal, teaching them to remember the man even as his name was erased from the rolls of the living. They waited not for months, but for decades, their hair whitening under the burden of hope that was mocked by the silence of officialdom. Their loyalty became a form of defiance against the machinery of the state, a refusal to let the condemned be forgotten. In their steadfastness, they bore witness that love could survive not just hardship, but the systematic attempt to annihilate it. Yet the crucible was merciless, and many could not withstand its heat. Some women, broken by poverty, by loneliness, by the cold pragmatism of survival, sought another path. They remarried, they turned away, they allowed their men to vanish into the mist of history. To condemn them is easy. To understand them requires acknowledging the weight that crushed them daily. For the camps did not only strip men of their freedom, they shattered the fabric of family, leaving women to choose between starvation and betrayal, between self-preservation and fidelity to a ghost. The survivors of the Gulag remembered these stories with a kind of grim clarity. For them, loyalty was not a romantic word but a lived experience, one that carved deep scars on the soul. The letters that did arrive, rare as spring in a Siberian winter, became proof of an unbroken bond, tokens more nourishing than food itself. The silences, too, spoke volumes. Men learned that abandonment could kill more swiftly than cold, that betrayal of the heart could be a deeper wound than the lash of the guard's whip. In this way, the test of female loyalty became a hidden chapter of the Gulag, unwritten in official histories, but inscribed in the memories of those who endured it. Women bore chains no less heavy than men, though their prisons had no walls, and the choices they made, whether to wait, to endure, to turn away, revealed truths about the human spirit that the state could neither command nor destroy. Loyalty in the shadow of the camps was never a simple virtue. It was a burden carried in silence, an oath made not with words but with suffering. The paradox was that fidelity could be both salvation and torment, both a proof of love and a sentence to despair. To remain loyal meant enduring years of waiting with no certainty of return, clinging to the image of a man whose body might already lie in the frozen earth. To abandon meant survival, the chance to rebuild a shattered life, but also the stain of betrayal carried like an invisible scar. Between these two extremes, countless women and men stood suspended, torn by forces greater than themselves. The survivors spoke of loyalty, not as a beautiful ideal, but as a double-edged truth. Those who were remembered, who received letters and parcels, felt a strength that the guards could not take from them. A word written in a trembling hand could be more nourishing than bread, more sustaining than fire. It gave a man the will to endure one more day, to lift one more log, to fight off despair one more night. Yet this same loyalty inflicted wounds of its own, for it tied the heart of the prisoner to the suffering of another far away. He knew that every parcel cost a sacrifice, that every letter carried risk. The very knowledge of her devotion was both a comfort and a weight, for he bore the guilt of dragging another life into the abyss of his punishment. For the women who remained faithful, the paradox was no less cruel. Loyalty became a form of imprisonment. Every day was chained to the hope of return, to the thought that at any moment the knock on the door might announce the end of exile. They endured whispers, poverty, and solitude, all while holding themselves bound to an uncertain promise. To let go of that promise might have meant relief, but to let go was to erase the man from memory, to side with the state in its attempt to obliterate him. Thus, loyalty was both an act of resistance and an act of suffering, a virtue that devoured the life of the one who upheld it. And yet abandonment carried its own paradox. A woman who chose to survive by seeking another path was condemned in the hearts of those who returned. To the survivors, her abandonment was not only a personal wound, but also a reflection of how the world outside had conspired with the camp to erase them. But she too had lived in captivity of another kind, the captivity of hunger, of loneliness, of fear. Her betrayal was not always born of weakness. Often it was the brutal demand of life itself. The paradox of loyalty is that both faithfulness and abandonment carried truth, and both carried pain. In the end, loyalty revealed itself not as a simple moral choice, but as a crucible in which human beings were tested beyond ordinary endurance. It exposed the raw collision between love and survival, between devotion and despair. For some, loyalty was a torch in the dark. For others, it was the chain that dragged them deeper into suffering. The paradox was that both loyalty and its absence carried the same weight. They bound the fates of men and women to a history written not by choice, but by the merciless hand of suffering. The men who walked out of the camps, if they walked out at all, carried with them not only scars carved into their bodies, but truths carved even deeper into their souls. These truths were rarely spoken aloud. Words could never bear the full weight of what had been endured, and besides, the world outside had no patience for their revelations. Families, neighbors, even strangers preferred to hear of survival in terms of endurance or courage, but the survivors knew that courage was only a fragment of the story. What they carried was knowledge, silent, heavy, and unyielding, the kind that altered the way they looked at every face, every gesture, every act of kindness or betrayal. This knowledge was not theoretical. It was not the kind learned in books or written in sermons. It came from watching men break beneath hunger, from seeing friends barter away their last piece of dignity for a crust of bread, from remembering which names were called during the endless roll calls and which voices fell silent in the night. The survivors had witnessed the stripping away of all illusions. They knew what a human being became when reduced to pure survival, when nothing remained but the will to endure or the temptation to surrender. The silence of survivors was not mere secrecy. It was a kind of reverence, a recognition that what they had seen could not be explained without being diminished. To speak of it too lightly would turn it into a tale, an anecdote, something consumable. But to remain silent preserved the weight of it. Each survivor carried this truth like a stone in the chesty, who had been loyal, who had betrayed, who had endured, who had perished with dignity intact. These were not abstractions but names, faces, moments burned into memory. Loyalty, as they understood it, was not a matter of declarations. It was revealed in actions, often small, often unseen by others. A parcel sent in defiance of poverty, a letter written though likely never delivered. A wife who refused to remarry even after decades of waiting. These acts became sacred in the minds of those who suffered, proof that love could survive the machinery of erasure. But just as sacred were the lessons of abandonment, for they too revealed something undeniable, that suffering spares no one, that love and loyalty are not inexhaustible, and that even the strongest bonds can be undone by despair. This silent knowledge shaped how the survivors looked upon the world after their release. They could not return to ordinary illusions of stability or comfort. They had seen what lay beneath the skin of society, the fragile foundation upon which every human relationship rested. To them, loyalty was no longer a given but a miracle, betrayal no longer an outrage, but a possibility ever present in the human heart. They bore within them the certainty that nothing in life could be trusted fully except the truth revealed in suffering, and that truth, though bitter, unshakable. Thus they lived with an unspoken understanding, a gaze that could unsettle those who had not endured what they endured. They did not need to explain, for their silence carried more weight than words ever could. It was the silence of men who had walked through death's antechamber and returned with knowledge that the world would rather not confront, knowledge that love and loyalty, when tested in fire, revealed not only the greatness of the human spirit, but also its fragility. In the crucible of suffering, human bonds reveal their truest form, and yet it is in that same crucible that they are most fragile. The camps stripped men and women of illusions, forcing them to witness what remained when every comfort was gone. Bonds forged in ordinary life, marriages, friendships, loyalties, were tested under conditions so severe that even memory seemed like a luxury. In such a place, trust could not be assumed. It was a flame that flickered constantly against the winds of hunger, fear, and despair. The survivors carried with them the knowledge that human love and loyalty were never as solid as the world outside believed. They were delicate threads, beautiful when intact, devastating when broken. The fragility of human bonds became visible in the smallest gestures. Shared crust of bread could elevate a man to sainthood in the eyes of his fellow prisoners, while a moment of selfishness could mark him forever as a betrayer. Bonds were stretched thin by necessity. Letters from the outside, smuggled parcels, or even whispers of a loved one's survival became lifelines, but they were lifelines made of glass. They could sustain the spirit, But if shattered by betrayal or abandonment, the wound was far deeper than hunger or cold could inflict. Hunger gnawed at the body, but broken trust hollowed out the soul. For the survivors, the most haunting memories were often not of cruelty from guards or the machinery of oppression, but of how fragile the bonds of love could prove to be. They remembered the men who were forgotten by their families, the wives who remarried in absence, the friends who chose safety over loyalty. These memories were not carried as accusations, but as scars of truth. They revealed the human condition in its most naked form, where loyalty was not guaranteed but miraculous, where betrayal was not simply a moral failing but a human inevitability under extreme strain. The survivors understood that loyalty could survive, but only rarely, and when it did, it glowed like a faint star against a dark sky. They knew of women who waited faithfully through years of silence, who carried the burden of shame, poverty, and solitude, yet never abandoned the bond they had chosen. They knew of friends who risked their own survival to share, who endured humiliation without surrendering another's name. These acts were fragile, easily destroyed by weakness. But when they endured, they carried a strength greater than the iron bars of the camp itself. Fragility, in their understanding, was not weakness, but reality. Human bonds were not indestructible chains, but fine threads of glass, beautiful in their delicacy, painful in their breaking. To carry this knowledge into the free world was to see every smile, every handshake, every declaration of love with new eyes. Survivors knew that every bond carried within it the potential for both loyalty and betrayal, and it was this double vision that set them apart from those who had never endured the fire of despair. They had learned that what binds people together is not certainty but risk, not permanence but the fragile decision to remain faithful in the face of unbearable temptation to turn away. The testimony left behind by those who endured the camps is not merely a chronicle of pain, but a mirror held up to the human condition. Stripped of illusions, they discovered truths about loyalty, love, and the frailty of bonds that the free world prefers to ignore. Their witness shows us that suffering reveals both the noblest and most fragile dimensions of human nature, where a crust of bread or a single letter could mean more than entire nations' promises, and where silence often preserved more truth than words. The survivors carried no grand proclamations. Instead, they bore the quiet knowledge that loyalty, though rare, is luminous, that betrayal, though bitter, deeply human, and that every bond we cherish is as delicate as glass. They understood that faithfulness is not born in comfort, but tested in despair, and that love endures not through ease, but through fire. Their lives remind us that the strength of human connection lies not in its certainty, but in its risk. The decision, renewed again and again, to remain faithful in the face of forces that would tear us apart.